Marcus had always been a man of simple habits. He woke up before dawn, tended to his small farm in rural Arizona, and went to bed when the stars filled the sky. His property sat at the edge of what used to be Apache territory, surrounded by red clay hills and endless stretches of desert scrubland. Life was predictable, quiet, and exactly how he liked it. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when he found them. He had been checking his fence line near the old canyon road when he heard something unusual. It wasn't the wind or the occasional coyote that wandered through his property. This was different. Human voices, strained and desperate, echoing from somewhere below the ridge. Marcus grabbed his water canteen and climbed down the rocky slope, his boots sliding on loose gravel. The voices grew louder, more frantic. When he reached a small clearing hidden by twisted juniper trees, he stopped dead in his tracks. 2 women were there, bound tightly with thick ropes that cut into their wrists and ankles. They were massive in stature, both easily over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and muscular frames that spoke of incredible strength. Their long black hair was tangled and dusty, their faces marked with dirt and exhaustion. Despite their obvious distress, there was something fierce and dignified about them, something that made Marcus hesitate before approaching. The older of the 2 noticed him first. Her dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch. She didn't look afraid. Instead, there was a calculating intelligence in her gaze, as if she were measuring him, deciding whether he was friend or foe. Marcus raised his hands slowly, showing he meant no harm. He called out in a calm voice, asking if they needed help. The woman's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across her features. She spoke in a language he didn't understand, her voice deep and commanding despite her bound state. The younger woman beside her spoke too, her words rapid and urgent. Marcus could see the family resemblance between them now. The same strong jawline, the same proud bearing. Sisters, he realized, and from their appearance and the few words he could make out, they were Apache. He approached carefully, pulling out his pocket knife. The older sister tensed, but when Marcus knelt beside her and began cutting through the ropes, she seemed to understand. Her eyes never left his face as he worked, sawing through the thick bindings that had left deep marks on her skin. As soon as her hands were free, she immediately reached for her sister, helping Marcus remove the ropes from the younger woman's wrists and ankles. They both stood slowly, stretching their cramped muscles, testing their freedom. Marcus took a step back, giving them space. The older sister spoke again, this time in broken English mixed with Apache words. From what Marcus could understand, they had been taken by traffickers 3 days ago, bound and left here while their captors went to arrange a buyer. The men were supposed to return today. Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew the area had problems with human trafficking, especially of native women, but he'd never encountered it directly. These women needed help, and they needed it fast. He offered them water from his canteen, which they accepted gratefully. As they drank, he explained that his farm was about 2 miles north, that they could rest there and figure out what to do next. The older sister translated for the younger one, who nodded but still looked wary. They began the trek back to his property, moving quickly despite the rough terrain. The sisters were surprisingly quiet, their movements efficient and purposeful. Even weak from days without proper food or water, they kept pace with Marcus easily, their long strides eating up the distance. When they reached his farmhouse, a modest structure with peeling paint and a wraparound porch, the sisters paused. The older one studied the property with careful attention, noting the well-maintained fences, the small vegetable garden, the chicken coop in the distance. She seemed to be assessing something, making some kind of decision. Marcus led them inside, offering them seats at his kitchen table. He prepared food quickly, scrambled eggs and toast, nothing fancy but filling. The sisters ate with controlled hunger, never rushing but clearly famished. Between bites, the older sister introduced herself as Ayita, and her younger sister as Chanoa. Ayita explained more of their story in halting English. They had been traveling to visit family on a reservation 3 states away when they were ambushed at a rest stop. Their car was stolen, their phones taken. The traffickers had specifically targeted them because of their size and strength, planning to sell them to some kind of illegal fighting operation. Marcus listened, his anger growing with each detail. When Ayita finished, he promised them they could stay as long as they needed. He would help them contact their family, get them home safely. But Aida shook her head. She explained that going home wasn't simple. They had left their reservation under difficult circumstances, family conflicts that had made staying impossible. They had been looking for a fresh start, new opportunities. Now they had nothing. No car, no money, no identification. Everything had been taken. Chenoa spoke up then, her English better than her sister's. She asked Marcus directly why he was helping them. What did he want in return? There was suspicion in her voice, a hardness born from recent trauma. Marcus met her gaze steadily. He told them the truth. He had been raised to help people when they needed it. His own grandfather had been helped by Apache people decades ago when he'd gotten lost in the desert. This was just paying forward old kindness. Something in Aida's expression softened at those words. She conferred quietly with Chenoa in Apache, a rapid conversation that Marcus couldn't follow. Then she turned back to him with a proposition. They needed a place to stay, to recover and plan their next steps. Marcus needed help on his farm. The work was too much for one person, and he'd been struggling to keep up. If he let them stay, they would work for their keep. It would be temporary, just until they could get back on their feet. Marcus considered the offer. His farm could certainly use the help, and these women clearly needed sanctuary. He agreed, setting simple terms. They would help with the daily work, he would provide room and board, and when they were ready to move on, they could do so freely. Aida extended her hand, and Marcus shook it. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused from hard work. Chenoa stood and shook his hand as well, though her eyes still held traces of doubt. That evening, Marcus set them up in his guest rooms, small spaces but clean and private. As the sun set over the red hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he stood on his porch and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Two mysterious Apache sisters, both powerful and guarded, now living on his isolated farm. He had no idea that this decision would change everything, that these temporary guests would become something far more permanent than any of them could have imagined. The first few days were awkward. Aida and Chenoa moved around the farm like shadows, present but distant, helping with chores but rarely speaking unless necessary. Marcus gave them space, understanding that trust would take time. He showed them the daily routines, the feeding schedules for the animals, the irrigation system for the garden, and the endless maintenance a working farm required. What surprised him most was their capacity for work. Despite having just escaped captivity, both sisters threw themselves into every task with fierce determination. Chenoa handled the heavier lifting with ease, moving hay bales that would have taken Marcus 2 trips. Aida had a gift with the animals, calming his temperamental horse with soft words in Apache, and getting the stubborn chickens to cooperate without the usual chaos. By the end of the first week, the farm was running more smoothly than it had in years. Fences that had needed repair were fixed. The vegetable garden was properly weeded and watered. And even the old barn door that had been hanging crooked for months was finally straight. Marcus found himself watching them work sometimes, amazed at their coordination. They moved in sync, anticipating each other's needs without speaking, communicating in glances and small gestures. It spoke of a bond deeper than typical siblings, forged through shared experiences he could only imagine. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Aida finally opened up more. She explained that they came from a long line of strong women, warriors in the old stories. Their family had always produced daughters of unusual size and strength, a trait that had been both blessing and curse. On the reservation, they had been respected but also isolated, set apart by their physical differences. Chenoa added that the modern world was even harder. People stared, made assumptions, treated them as spectacles or threats. Finding regular work was nearly impossible. Employers either feared them or wanted to exploit their strength without fair compensation. The journey they'd been on when captured was supposed to lead to a fresh start, a place where they might find acceptance. Marcus listened without judgment, nodding occasionally. He shared his own story, how he'd inherited this farm from his grandfather but struggled to make it profitable, how he'd chosen isolation over the complexities of society, finding peace in the simple rhythm of agricultural life. He understood being an outsider, even if his reasons were different. Something shifted that night. The walls between them began to lower. Aida smiled for the first time, a genuine expression that transformed her stern features. Chenoa's guarded posture relaxed slightly. They began to feel less like temporary workers and more like actual people sharing space. The next morning brought unexpected trouble. Marcus was in the barn when he heard the sound of vehicles approaching. 2 trucks pulled up to his property, and 4 rough-looking men climbed out. His stomach dropped when he recognized the type. Hard faces, calculating eyes, the kind of men who made their living in the shadows. They were looking for something, they said. Or rather someone. 2 Apache women, large and valuable. They'd heard rumors that someone matching their description had been seen near his property. They wanted to search his land. Marcus stood his ground, blocking the path to his house. He told them they had no right to search anything without a warrant. The men laughed, suggesting that he didn't understand how things worked out here in the middle of nowhere. One of them moved toward the house anyway. That's when Aida stepped out onto the porch. She had a shotgun in her hands, Marcus's old hunting rifle that he'd shown them where to find in case of emergencies. Her stance was confident, her aim steady. Chenoa appeared beside her, holding a heavy wrench like a weapon. The confrontation froze. The men recognized the sisters immediately, their expressions shifting from aggression to calculation. They were outnumbered and outgunned, at least in that moment. The leader tried negotiation, claiming the women were stolen property, that there would be consequences for harboring them. Marcus stepped forward, his voice cold and steady. He informed them that these women were free individuals working on his farm legally. If they had claims otherwise, they could take it up with the sheriff. He pulled out his phone, making a show of preparing to dial. The traffickers weren't stupid. They knew that involving law enforcement would bring scrutiny they couldn't afford. But the leader made a point of staring at each of them, memorizing faces. He promised this wasn't over, that they'd be back. Then they climbed into their trucks and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. As soon as they were gone, the adrenaline hit. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he realized how close they'd come to violence. But when he looked at the sisters, they seemed surprisingly calm. Aida lowered the shotgun with practiced ease, while Chenoa's grip on the wrench never wavered until the trucks were completely out of sight. They all went inside, and Marcus locked the doors, something he rarely did. Over coffee, they discussed what to do. The men would likely return with more people better prepared. The sisters offered to leave to draw the danger away from Marcus and his farm, but Marcus refused. He'd made a commitment when he agreed to help them, and he wasn't the kind of man to back down from that. Besides, he argued, the farm was defensible. They had supplies, they had weapons, and they had warning now. If they prepared properly, they could handle whatever came next. Aida studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She made a suggestion. They should set up a proper defense system. She had learned tactics from elders on the reservation, old warrior strategies adapted for modern times. With Chenoa's strength and Marcus's knowledge of the property, they could make the farm into a stronghold. Over the next few days, they transformed the property. They set up early warning systems using simple technology. Motion sensors connected to lights, strategically placed mirrors to eliminate blind spots, reinforced locks on all buildings. Chenoa dug defensive positions and created obstacles that would slow any vehicles trying to approach quickly. Marcus taught them to shoot properly, taking them to a makeshift range he set up beyond the south pasture. Both sisters proved to be quick learners, their steady hands and sharp eyes making them natural marksmen. Aida, in particular, showed an uncanny ability to hit targets at distance. But it wasn't all preparation and tension. In the quiet moments between security measures, they continued to work the farm, to share meals, to talk about everything from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. Marcus found himself looking forward to these conversations, to Chenoa's dry humor and Aida's thoughtful observations. The farm began to feel less like his solitary refuge and more like a shared home. The sisters' presence brought energy to the place, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. They planted new crops together, planned improvements, talked about maybe getting more livestock if things settled down. 2 weeks after the traffickers' visit, nothing had happened. No return visits, no further threats. Marcus started to wonder if maybe they'd given up, decided the sisters weren't worth the trouble, but Aida remained vigilant, insisting they maintain their security measures. She had a feeling, she said, that the quiet was deceptive. She was right. On a moonless night, Marcus woke to the sound of one of their motion alarms. He grabbed his rifle and found both sisters already awake, armed and ready. Through the window they could see flashlights in the distance, multiple figures approaching from different directions. The traffickers had returned, and this time they'd brought reinforcements. The real test was about to begin, and everything they'd built together would be put to the ultimate challenge. Marcus counted at least 8 flashlights moving through the darkness toward his property. The traffickers had come prepared this time, spreading out to surround the farmhouse from multiple angles. His heart hammered in his chest, but when he glanced at Aita and Chenoa, their calm focus steadied him. Aita had already moved to the living room window, positioning herself with a clear view of the main approach. Chenoa took the kitchen, covering the eastern side. Marcus stayed in the bedroom, watching the north pasture where 2 figures were trying to use his tractor for cover. The first shot wasn't fired by either side. Instead, Aita triggered the spotlight Marcus had rigged to the barn roof, flooding the front yard with brilliant white light. The approaching men froze, suddenly exposed, their shadows stark against the dusty ground. Aita's voice rang out strong and clear, speaking in Apache first, then English. She told them this was their only warning. Leave now or face the consequences. Her words carried weight, the authority of someone who meant every syllable. For a moment nothing happened. Then the leader's voice called back, trying to sound reasonable. They just wanted what belonged to them. If the sisters came peacefully, no one would get hurt. Marcus shouted his own response. These women didn't belong to anyone. This was private property, and they were all armed and prepared to defend it. He'd already called the sheriff, he lied, and law enforcement was on the way. It was a bluff, but a necessary one. His nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the sheriff's office was even farther. The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Then one of the men made a mistake. He tried to rush the porch, probably hoping to reach the door before anyone could react. Chenoa's warning shot kicked up dirt inches from his feet, and he scrambled backward so fast he fell. That broke the tension. Gunfire erupted, but it was wild, undisciplined. The traffickers were shooting blindly at windows, trying to intimidate rather than hit anything. Marcus, Aita, and Chenoa held their fire, waiting. They had the advantage of position, protection, and patience. Marcus fired a shot that took out one of the truck's headlights, plunging that section of the yard back into darkness. Aita did the same to another vehicle. The message was clear. They were better shots, better prepared. This wasn't going to be the easy grab the traffickers had expected. The attackers regrouped, and Marcus heard shouting among them. They were arguing, some wanting to press forward, others realizing they'd underestimated the situation. Then came the sound of engines starting. 2 of the trucks began backing away, their drivers having had enough, but the leader and 3 others remained. They changed tactics, trying to circle around to the barn where they'd have better cover. Marcus realized with cold clarity that they were planning to burn them out, to use fire to force them from the house. He warned the sisters, and Aita made a quick decision. They couldn't let the men reach the barn, where hay and old wood would turn into an inferno. Chenoa volunteered to stop them, and before Marcus could argue, she was already moving. She went out the back door, using the darkness and her knowledge of the property to circle around. Marcus watched anxiously from the window as her shadow merged with the night. Minutes passed like hours. Then he heard a commotion near the barn, sounds of struggle. A man's shout of surprise cut short. Chenoa reappeared, dragging 2 men by their collars like they weighed nothing. She disarmed them both, and from their dazed expressions she'd done it with her bare hands. She deposited them in the yard where the spotlight caught them, then melted back into the shadows. The remaining 2 traffickers saw their companions disabled so easily, and something broke in their resolve. The leader shouted a retreat, and they scrambled for the last truck. Within minutes, the vehicle was racing away down the dirt road, leaving behind the 2 captured men who were now sitting with their hands on their heads, thoroughly defeated. Marcus and Aita emerged from the house cautiously, weapons ready, but the captured men made no move to resist. They looked terrified, particularly when Chenoa stepped into the light, her imposing frame and stern expression making them shrink back. Aita questioned them in Apache, her voice sharp and commanding. They answered quickly, desperately. From what Marcus could understand from her translation, they were low-level workers, hired muscle who'd been promised easy money. They gave up their employer's name, a man named Delgado who ran trafficking operations throughout the Southwest. The information was valuable, but it also meant the danger wasn't over. Delgado wouldn't stop just because one attempt had failed. He had resources, connections, and a reputation to maintain. If word got out that he'd been beaten by one farmer and 2 women, it would damage his standing in the criminal underworld. Marcus called the real sheriff this time, reporting armed intruders on his property. While they waited for law enforcement to arrive, which would take at least 40 minutes, Chenoa tied up the captives with expert knots. The men sat quietly, occasionally glancing at her with expressions mixing fear and respect. Aita paced the porch, thinking. She told Marcus that this wouldn't end with arrests. Delgado operated with near immunity in this region, paying off officials and intimidating witnesses. Even if these men talked, nothing would stick. They needed a different solution. When the deputy finally arrived, a young woman named Rodriguez, she took statements and arrested the 2 men. But Marcus could see the resignation in her eyes when they mentioned Delgado's name. She promised to file a report but warned them to be careful. Delgado had a long reach and a longer memory. After she left with the prisoners, the 3 of them sat in the kitchen, exhausted but too wired to sleep. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the reality of their situation. They'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. Aita broke the silence with a proposal. They needed to go on offense. Delgado operated from a compound about 60 miles south near the border. If they could gather evidence of his operations and get it to the right federal authorities, bypassing the corrupted local system, they might end this permanently. Marcus stared at her. She was suggesting they infiltrate a criminal compound, gather intelligence, and basically declare war on a trafficking kingpin. It was insane, dangerous, probably suicidal. But as he looked at both sisters, at the determination in their eyes and the set of their jaws, he realized they were going to do it with or without him. The farm had become more than just a refuge. It had become home, and these women had become family. He couldn't let them face this alone, no matter how crazy the plan seemed. Chenoa smiled at him, reading his decision before he spoke it. She said something in Apache to Aita, who nodded and translated, "She says you have warrior's heart even if you're just a farmer." Marcus laughed despite the tension. Just a farmer. 2 weeks ago, that's all he'd been. Now he was planning to take down a trafficking operation with 2 Apache sisters who'd somehow become the most important people in his life. They spent the rest of the night planning, using maps and what information they could find online about Delgado's operations. Aita had contacts on reservations throughout the region, people who'd had dealings with Delgado or knew of his victims. She made calls, quietly gathering intelligence while Marcus and Chenoa prepared supplies. By dawn, they had a rough plan. It would require splitting up, taking risks, and trusting each other completely. Aita would use her connections to get inside information. Chenoa would handle reconnaissance, using her strength and stealth to scout the compound. Marcus would be their anchor, coordinating from the farm and ready to extract them if things went wrong. As the sun rose over the red hills, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Marcus stood on his porch with the sisters beside him. His quiet life was gone, replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. But as he looked at them, at the bond they'd formed through adversity, he found he didn't regret a single moment. They were in this together now, bound by more than circumstance. They were bound by choice, by loyalty, by a shared purpose that went beyond mere survival. The farm had given them sanctuary, but they'd given it something more valuable. They'd given it meaning. The preparation took 3 days. Aita left first, heading to various reservations to meet with her contacts and gather information about Delgado's operations. She returned with disturbing details. The trafficking ring was even larger than they'd thought, with connections stretching across state lines and into Mexico. But she'd also found weaknesses in the organization, patterns they could exploit. Chenoa spent those days training, pushing her body to peak readiness. Marcus watched her run miles across the desert, scale the barn walls, practice moving silently through brush. She was preparing for war with the focus of someone who'd done it before, though she never spoke of where she'd learned such skills. Marcus's role was coordination and backup. He set up secure communication lines, borrowed equipment from a veteran friend who didn't ask questions, and memorized every detail of the compound's layout from satellite images Aida had obtained. His farmhouse became a command center, maps covering the kitchen table, supplies stacked in every corner. On the fourth morning, Chenoa prepared to leave for her reconnaissance mission. She would pose as a potential victim, using the same rest stop where she and Aida had been taken. The plan was dangerous. Let herself be captured, learn the compound's interior, then escape when Marcus and Aida created a distraction from outside. Marcus hated the plan. Every instinct told him not to let Chenoa walk into that trap. But Aida assured him her sister could handle it. They'd been in worse situations, she said, though she didn't elaborate. The bond between the sisters was strong enough that Aida could send Chenoa into danger with confidence. Before she left, Chenoa did something unexpected. She pulled Marcus aside and thanked him, speaking in careful English. She said he'd given them more than shelter. He'd given them trust, treated them as equals rather than curiosities or threats. Whatever happened, she wanted him to know that mattered. Marcus didn't know what to say. He settled for a firm handshake that turned into a brief, awkward hug. Chenoa smiled, her usually stern face softening, then climbed into his old truck and drove away. He watched until the dust settled, then turned to find Aida watching him with an unreadable expression. That day crawled by. Marcus tried to work, to maintain normal routines, but his mind was 60 miles south where Chenoa was walking into danger. Aida seemed calm, but he noticed her checking her phone constantly, waiting for the signal that Chenoa had been taken. The message came at sunset, a single word in Apache that Aida had been expecting. Chenoa was inside the compound. Now came the hardest part, waiting while she gathered information, memorized layouts, identified key players. They'd agreed on 48 hours before the extraction attempt. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He found Aida on the porch staring at the stars. She was singing softly in Apache, an old song her grandmother had taught her. When she noticed him, she didn't stop, and he sat beside her, letting the unfamiliar words wash over him. When the song ended, she told him about her and Chenoa's childhood, how they'd been different from other children, growing faster and stronger, how their grandmother had told them stories of warrior women in their bloodline, women who'd fought beside Apache warriors in the old days, defending their people with strength and courage. She explained that their size wasn't just genetics. It was legacy, responsibility. They'd been raised to protect others, to use their strength in service of their community. But modern life had made that complicated. Their reservation had no place for warriors anymore, and the outside world saw them as freaks or threats. Marcus understood then why they'd adapted so quickly to the farm, to the conflict with Delgado. This wasn't new to them. They'd been fighting their whole lives, just in different ways. The farm had given them what they'd been searching for, a purpose, a place where their strength was valued rather than feared. He shared his own story more fully, about the loneliness he'd felt before they arrived, the sense of going through motions without meaning. The farm had been his refuge from a world that felt too complicated, too demanding, but their arrival had shown him what he'd been missing: connection, partnership, family chosen rather than given. Aida reached over and took his hand, a simple gesture that felt profound in the starlight. She told him that no matter what happened with Delgado, they would stay if he wanted them. The farm felt right in a way nothing else ever had. It was home, not just a hiding place. The 48 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Then Chenoa's signal came, the one indicating she was ready for extraction. She'd learned the compound's layout, identified where evidence was stored, and found the locations where other victims were being held. But she'd also discovered something worse. Delgado was planning a major operation, moving dozens of people across the border in 3 days. They had to move now. Not just to extract Chenoa, but to stop the operation and save those victims. Marcus felt the weight of it, the responsibility. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. Other lives depended on their success. Aida made calls to federal contacts she'd cultivated, agents who'd been trying to catch Delgado for years. She fed them information, promised them more if they'd position themselves for a raid. They were skeptical but desperate enough to listen. She arranged for them to move in exactly 4 hours after she gave the final signal. Marcus and Aida drove south in his truck, weapons hidden under blankets. determination etched on their faces. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Aita would create a distraction at the compound's front gate, while Marcus circled to the back where Chenoa would be waiting. Then they'd extract both Chenoa and as many victims as possible before federal agents arrived. As they approached the compound, Marcus felt his hands trembling on the steering wheel. He'd been a farmer his whole life, never imagined himself in a situation like this. But when he glanced at Aita, saw the fierce determination in her profile, he found his courage. She was worth fighting for. Chenoa was worth fighting for. The people trapped in that compound were worth fighting for, and maybe, just maybe, he was becoming the kind of man worth fighting alongside. They parked a mile away and moved in on foot, using the desert darkness as cover. The compound appeared as a cluster of buildings surrounded by high fences, lights blazing at regular intervals. Guards patrolled in predictable patterns, exactly as Chenoa had described in her messages. Aita squeezed his shoulder once, then moved toward the front gate. Marcus circled right, counting his steps, timing his movement to the guard's rotation. His heart hammered so loud he was sure someone would hear it, but he kept moving. He reached the back fence just as an explosion rocked the front of the compound. Aita had set off her distraction, something dramatic enough to pull all attention forward. Alarms blared, men shouted, and in the chaos Marcus cut through the fence and slipped inside. Chenoa was waiting in the shadows, exactly where she'd promised. She had 5 other women with her, all looking terrified but determined. Marcus led them back through the hole in the fence, moving quickly, while the compound's attention remained on Aita's diversion. They'd made it 50 yards into the desert when gunfire erupted behind them. Marcus's blood ran cold. That wasn't part of the plan. Aita was supposed to escape before anyone could engage her. Something had gone wrong. Chenoa heard it too. Without hesitation, she told Marcus to keep moving with the rescued women, to get them to safety. Then she turned and ran back toward the compound, toward the sound of gunfire, toward her sister. Marcus watched her go, torn between completing the mission and following. The women he was protecting needed him, but so did the sisters. For a terrible moment he froze, unable to decide. Then one of the rescued women took his arm, speaking urgently in Spanish. She was telling him to trust the sisters, that they could handle themselves, that his job was to save them. She was right. He had his role to play. With a prayer on his lips, Marcus led the women away from the compound, toward where federal agents would soon arrive. Behind him, gunfire continued, and he could only hope that both sisters would survive long enough to see the justice they'd fought so hard to achieve. Marcus pushed the rescued women forward through the desert darkness, every fiber of his being wanting to turn back toward the compound. The gunfire behind them had intensified, punctuated by shouts in Spanish and English. He could picture Aita and Chenoa fighting back to back, their warrior heritage rising to meet impossible odds. The 5 women stumbled beside him, exhausted but driven by the promise of freedom. The youngest couldn't have been more than 19, her eyes wide with trauma. The oldest was maybe 40, and she kept looking back with concern, asking in broken English about the women who'd helped them escape. Marcus assured them the sisters would be fine, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He checked his phone constantly, waiting for Aita's message that they were clear. Nothing came, just the distant sound of chaos and combat growing fainter as they moved deeper into the desert. They reached the predetermined meeting point, a dry riverbed where federal agents were supposed to rendezvous. But the location was empty, just sand and starlight. Marcus checked his watch. The agents were late. His stomach knotted with worry about what that might mean. Then headlights appeared, multiple vehicles approaching fast. Marcus positioned himself between the women and the lights, his hand on his concealed weapon. But as the vehicles drew closer, he saw the official markings. Federal agents finally arriving. But they were moving with urgency that suggested they'd heard about the firefight. The lead agent, a woman named Torres, jumped out before her SUV fully stopped. She immediately began organizing, getting the rescued women into vehicles, taking brief statements, coordinating with her team. But when Marcus asked about the sisters, about sending people back to extract them, her expression darkened. Local police had responded to the compound. There had been a shootout, multiple casualties on Delgado's side, but 2 women matching Aita and Chenoa's description had been taken into custody, arrested along with the surviving traffickers. Torres explained it like she'd seen it before. Local cops protecting Delgado's operation, arresting the victims and heroes as easily as the criminals. Marcus's world tilted. The sisters had freed captives and exposed a trafficking ring, and they were being treated like criminals. He demanded to know where they'd been taken, which facility, but Torres held up her hand. She told him to calm down, that she understood the situation. Her team had been building a case against Delgado for 2 years. The local arrests were actually a blessing in disguise. With the sisters in custody, they could coordinate a proper federal intervention, take over the case, and ensure justice was served. But it would take time, maybe 24 to 48 hours. Marcus wanted to explode. 2 days of Aida and Chenoa locked up with corrupt officers who might be on Delgado's payroll. Anything could happen in that time. They could disappear, be transferred, or worse. He couldn't just wait and hope the system worked, but Torres was firm. Any attempt to interfere would compromise their case. The rescued women's testimonies, combined with evidence Chenoa had gathered inside the compound, would be enough to bring down Delgado's entire network. But only if they followed proper procedure. She promised the sisters would be protected, kept separate from other prisoners, monitored constantly. Marcus had no choice but to trust her. He gave his statement, provided every detail he could about their investigation, described the layout of the compound and the security measures they'd encountered. Then he drove back to his farm alone, the truck feeling empty without Aida beside him, without knowing Chenoa was safe. The farmhouse felt hollow when he arrived near dawn. He walked through rooms that still held traces of the sisters' presence. Aida's jacket on a chair, Chenoa's boots by the door, the scent of the herbal tea they drank each morning. The place had become a home with them in it. Now it was just a house again. He tried to sleep but couldn't. Every sound made him jump, every shadow seemed threatening. He'd grown accustomed to their presence, to the security of having warriors watching his back. Without them, he felt vulnerable in ways he hadn't since finding them bound in that canyon. The hours crawled past. Marcus cleaned weapons that didn't need cleaning, checked fences that were already secure, did anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from spiraling into worst-case scenarios. He thought about driving to the police station where they were being held, demanding to see them, but he knew that would only make things worse. Afternoon brought a phone call from Torres. The sisters were safe, she assured him. They'd been transferred to federal custody that morning, ahead of schedule. Torres's team had moved quickly once they'd processed the scene and interviewed witnesses. Aida and Chenoa were being held as material witnesses rather than suspects, which meant they had rights and protections. But there was a complication. Delgado had survived the raid. He'd been wounded but not killed, and his lawyers were already working to pin everything on the sisters. They were claiming the women had orchestrated a robbery, that they were actually part of a rival trafficking operation. It was absurd, but with Delgado's money and connections, the accusations could stick long enough to cause serious problems. Torres needed the sisters to stay in protective custody, while her team built an airtight case. It could take weeks, maybe months. Marcus felt his heart sink. He asked if he could see them, speak to them, but Torres said no visitors yet. Too risky, too many ways it could be used against them in court. He hung up feeling helpless. The sisters were safe but imprisoned, protected but isolated, and he was here on the farm, unable to help, unable to even let them know he was thinking of them. Days blurred together. Marcus maintained the farm by rote, going through motions that felt meaningless. The work they'd done together, the improvements they'd planned, all of it seemed pointless without them there. He found himself talking to the animals, telling them the sisters would be back soon, trying to convince himself as much as the livestock. A week passed. Then 2. Torres called with updates. The case was progressing, more victims had come forward. Delgado's operation was unraveling. But the sisters remained in custody, their testimony too crucial to risk their release. Marcus asked repeatedly when they might come home, but Torres couldn't give him answers. He started to worry they'd never come back. Why would they? They'd found freedom, helped bring down their captors, exposed a massive criminal network. Once they were released, they could go anywhere, do anything. The farm was just a stopping point, a temporary refuge. They had no real reason to return. But then, 3 weeks after the raid, a letter arrived. Not through official channels, but hand-delivered by one of Torres's junior agents who happened to be passing through. It was from Aida, written in careful English with Apache words mixed in. She wrote about the facility where they were being held, how it was comfortable enough but felt like a cage. She wrote about Chenoa's frustration with confinement, how she paced the small room like a caged mountain lion, but mostly she wrote about the farm, about mornings feeding chickens, about the view from the porch at sunset, about working alongside Marcus in the garden. She wrote about home. Because that's what the farm had become to them, she said. Not just a place they'd stayed, but the first place they'd ever truly belonged. She asked if the offer still stood, if they could return when this was over. She promised they'd earn their keep, work harder than ever, cause no more trouble. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his throat tight with emotion. He immediately wrote back, his response simple and clear. The farm was their home as much as his. Their rooms were waiting. He was waiting. They belonged there, with him, for as long as they wanted to stay. He gave the letter to Torres's agent, who promised to deliver it. Then he threw himself into preparation. If the sisters were coming home, he wanted everything perfect. He repaired their rooms, bought new bedding, even attempted to build furniture that would accommodate their larger frames. He expanded the garden, repaired equipment, improved irrigation, all the projects they'd discussed. Every nail he hammered, every seed he planted, he did with the knowledge that they'd return. He had to believe it. The alternative was too painful to consider. 5 weeks after the raid, Torres called with news. The case had concluded. Delgado was facing federal charges that would ensure he'd never see freedom again. Dozens of his associates were arrested. The trafficking network was dismantled. And the sisters were being released. They'd be transported back to Arizona the next day. Torres asked if Marcus could pick them up from the federal building in Phoenix. He agreed immediately, already reaching for his truck keys before the call even ended. The next morning, Marcus drove to Phoenix with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. What if they'd changed their minds? What if protective custody had given them time to reconsider? What if they'd realized they wanted something more than life on an isolated farm with a man they'd known for barely 2 months? He arrived early and waited outside the federal building, watching every door. Then they emerged, Aida first, then Chenoa behind her. They looked tired, thinner than he remembered, but whole and healthy. They scanned the area until they spotted his truck, and both their faces transformed with genuine smiles. Marcus climbed out, suddenly unsure what to say. But Chenoa didn't need words. She crossed the distance in long strides and wrapped him in a hug that lifted him off his feet. Aida joined them, and for a moment the 3 of them just stood there in the Phoenix heat, holding on to each other like they'd never let go. When they finally pulled apart, Marcus saw tears in Aida's eyes. She said something in Apache, then translated, "We're home." The drive back to the farm was filled with conversation and laughter. Chenoa talked nonstop about how much she'd missed the open space, the smell of desert sage, the sound of chickens in the morning. Aida was quieter but kept touching things in the truck, the dashboard, the worn seat, as if reassuring herself this was real. They asked about the farm, and Marcus told them about every improvement he'd made, every project he'd completed. He'd meant to surprise them, but the words spilled out in his eagerness to share. Chenoa teased him about trying to do all the work himself, while Aida smiled and said she'd known he wouldn't let things fall apart. As they approached the property, Marcus felt nervous again. He'd worked so hard to prepare, but would it be enough? Would they still feel the same connection to the place after weeks away? But when the farmhouse came into view, both sisters leaned forward, drinking in the sight. The vegetables had grown tall in the garden. The fences gleamed with fresh paint, and even from a distance they could see the new chicken coop Marcus had built. The place looked cared for, loved, ready for them. They climbed out of the truck slowly, taking it all in. Chenoa walked to the garden, running her hands over tomato plants that had been seedlings when she left. Aida stood on the porch, exactly where she'd stood so many times before, looking out at the land that had become theirs. Marcus showed them their rooms, newly furnished and painted. He'd built beds strong enough to support their frames, added shelves and personal touches he hoped they'd like. Chenoa laughed when she saw the reinforced chair he'd constructed for her, while Aida's eyes grew misty at the care evident in every detail. That night, they cooked dinner together, falling back into familiar rhythms. Chenoa chopped vegetables with efficient movements. Aida prepared meat the way her grandmother had taught her, and Marcus handled the basics. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally bumping into each other in the small kitchen, smiling at the contact. Over dinner, they talked seriously about the future. The trial had changed things. Aida and Chenoa had been declared heroes by federal authorities, their actions credited with saving dozens of lives. But that attention also brought complications. People knew who they were now, where they'd been. Aida worried about their safety, about whether Delgado's associates might seek revenge. Marcus reminded her they'd prepared for that. The farm was secure and they'd proven they could defend themselves. Besides, he added, they were stronger together than apart. Whatever came, they'd face it as they had everything else. Chenoa brought up something that had been on her mind during custody. The farm couldn't support all three of them indefinitely, not without changes. They needed to expand, to make it profitable enough to sustain their new family. She had ideas, business plans she'd developed during long days of confinement. She suggested they specialize in heritage crops, vegetables and grains that connected to Apache traditions. Aida could market them to reservations and cultural centers, places that valued authentic indigenous agriculture. Marcus's land could become a source of cultural preservation as well as income. Marcus loved the idea immediately. It gave the farm purpose beyond mere survival, connected it to something larger. Aida nodded thoughtfully, already planning how to reach out to her contacts, how to build those connections. They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming. The farm would become more than a refuge. It would be a business, a cultural project, a home for all three of them. They'd work together, build together, create something meaningful together. As weeks passed, their lives found a new rhythm. They planted heritage corn and beans, ancient varieties passed down through Apache generations. Aida traveled to reservations, building relationships and securing contracts. Chenoa handled the heavy labor, her strength making possible projects Marcus could never have managed alone. The farm thrived in ways it never had before. Their first harvest was small but successful, earning enough to reinvest in expansion. Word spread about what they were doing, and other native farmers reached out wanting to learn, to collaborate. The isolated farm became a hub of activity and connection. Marcus found himself happier than he'd ever been. The loneliness that had driven him to isolation was gone, replaced by partnership and purpose. Aida and Chenoa weren't just workers or even friends. They were family, chosen and irreplaceable. One evening, 6 months after their return, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together at day's end. Chenoa broke the comfortable silence with a question that had been building for weeks. She asked Marcus if he ever regretted finding them that day in the canyon. If he ever wished for his simple, quiet life back. It was asked lightly, but he could hear the real concern beneath the words. Marcus took his time answering. He told them about the years before they arrived, the emptiness that had filled his days despite all his efforts to convince himself he was content. He described the moment he'd heard their voices and decided to investigate, not knowing it would change everything. He said finding them was the best thing that had ever happened to him. They'd brought purpose, connection, and meaning to his life. The farm wasn't just a place anymore. It was a home because they made it one. He wouldn't trade that for anything. Aida reached over and took his hand, squeezing gently. She said they felt the same way. They'd been searching for belonging their whole lives, moving from place to place, never quite fitting. But here on this small farm in Arizona, they'd found exactly what they needed. Chenoa added that they weren't going anywhere. This was home, he was family, and that was permanent. No matter what challenges came, they'd face them together, just as they had from the beginning. As the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Marcus felt a profound sense of peace. His life had taken an unexpected turn that day in the canyon, leading him down paths he'd never imagined. He'd faced danger, fought battles, made sacrifices, but sitting there with Aida and Chenoa, watching the day end on their farm, their home, he knew every moment had been worth it. They'd freed each other in ways that went beyond physical bonds. They'd freed each other from loneliness, from purposelessness, from the isolation they'd all been carrying. The farm had become more than land and buildings. It was a symbol of what they'd built together, a place where strength was valued, where differences were celebrated, where three unlikely people had found belonging, where two massive Apache sisters and one Arizona farmer had created something neither money nor force could ever break. Visitors who came to the farm always commented on the obvious bond between them, the way they moved in sync, anticipated each other's needs, communicated in glances and subtle gestures. They'd become a unit, a family forged not by blood but by choice and shared struggle. The heritage crop business grew steadily. Within a year, they were supplying a dozen reservations and several high-end restaurants that valued authentic indigenous ingredients. They hired help occasionally but kept the operation small, manageable, focused on quality over quantity. Ayita became known throughout indigenous communities as both a supplier and a preserver of agricultural traditions. She collected old seed varieties, learned forgotten farming techniques, and shared them freely. The farm became a living museum of Apache agriculture, a testament to survival and adaptation. Chenoa discovered she had a gift for teaching. Young people from nearby reservations came to learn traditional farming methods, and she guided them with patience that surprised everyone, including herself. She found purpose in passing on knowledge and helping others connect with their heritage. Marcus became the anchor, the steady presence that kept everything running. He managed the business side, handled logistics, and maintained the infrastructure. But more than that, he was the heart of their little family, the one who'd brought them together and kept them grounded. The farm that had once been Marcus's lonely refuge became a beacon of hope and possibility. It proved that family could be chosen, that home could be built rather than inherited, that three unlikely people could create something beautiful and lasting together. Years would pass, bringing new challenges and changes. But the bond formed that day in the canyon, strengthened through adversity and sealed by choice, would endure. Ayita and Chenoa had come to the farm as refugees seeking temporary shelter. They stayed as partners, as family, as integral parts of something greater than any of them alone. And Marcus, who'd once thought he needed solitude, discovered that what he'd really needed was exactly what he found: two fierce Apache sisters who saw past his isolation to the good man beneath, who chose to build a life alongside him, who transformed his farm from a hiding place into a true home. The sunset faded, stars emerged in the vast desert sky, and the three of them remained on the porch, content in each other's company. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges as every day did.